We are, the way the format is going to be, John's going to talk for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then we're going to have time to interact. I also wanted to just say thank you to Kevin, our senior warden, who's responsible for us identifying Jon. Kevin, I believe you read John's book and then reached out to him, and Jon lives locally, and so this worked out really, really nice. Jon is a senior political correspondent for Yahoo News. He is the author of Testimony Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation, which is his most recent book. Some of you have read it. And he's also the author of Camelot's End, Kennedy versus Carter and the Fight That Broke the Democratic Party. He is host of the Long Game podcast, and his Substack newsletter is called Border Stalkers. Jon has covered American politics and culture for more than 2 decades. So Jon's going to talk to us a little bit about his thoughts on his upbringing and evangelicalism, and also kind of how that intersects with politics today. And I'm sure it's going to be stimulating, and we're going to have a lot of questions for Jon, I'm sure, afterwards. So Jon, welcome. Let's join and welcome him.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here this morning on a rainy morning, not far from where I grew up. I grew up in the inner ring suburbs of Montgomery County, those post-World War II boomer suburbs. My father was a minister at an evangelical non-denominational church that he helped start, which began in a group of meetings in Washington, D.C., actually. He was raised Catholic. These were a group of, college-age folks coming together in the early 70s. And their Bible study began in a basement and then grew pretty rapidly. And he was one of the early leaders in that. It was called Take and Give, TAG. Then it became a church in sort of the Aspen Hill, Wheaton area. And then by the time I was 10, we moved out to Gaithersburg. So this has really been, this area has been where I grew up. I went to Montrose Christian High School in Rockville, which is no longer in existence. But if we have any NBA fans, Kevin Durant played basketball there after I had graduated. We've been creatures, my wife and I, and our children. We have 5 kids, ages 8 to 16, which I would say the number of kids, we're not Catholic, but the number of kids is sort of a remnant of the way I was raised in some ways. I think there's just patterns of thought there that have gone into that. But we're creatures of the hill, have been for the last, we moved to the hill in like 2009, outgrew that place as we continued to have children. And we've been in Hillcrest, which is close to Anacostia in Ward 7 for the last 6 years. And so I've kind of gone from a little north of you to a little southeast of you. But we make our way to Comet Pizza pretty frequently. And in fact, we were there the day that Joe Biden was announced as the winner of the election. We were sitting outside as cars kind of went up and down Wisconsin Avenue honking. And that was a really great day for us as a family and for us as a nation. So that, that comment right there sort of sets a marker for where I'm coming from politically, right? And I've already told you that I grew up evangelical in a very insular, very fundamentalist culture, church culture. And so I know, Ann and I have talked about let me just say one more thing about my book. Mm-hmm. My book kind of tells some of that story, my upbringing. And then it sort of traces the history of both my story and my church's story over the last 40 to 50 years, alongside the history of the religious right and the Republican Party. And then I also tell the story of how I came out of that world and became a journalist not long after college. And to kind of put it in the terms that I wrote for Christianity Today in a piece that it was headlined, Journalism Made Me a Better Christian. And it was talking about how the culture of journalism helped me grow in specific practices that made me a more faithful follower of Christ, discernment being one of them, I would say. Truth-telling being another. But I think, as I talked with Ann, we were talking about making sense of where we are politically, making sense of why there has been and continues to be so much conservative religious support for former President Trump. And I will do some of that, but as I even, mentioned that term truth-telling, it reminds me of something I think that became a conclusion as I came to the end of writing my book, which I think has only grown with time, which is that truth without love is ineffective. And I came to the conclusion that I burned, too hot at many times over the last decade. So that's something I'm grappling with right now, day to day. How do I make my way into the next year and beyond, while holding truth and a commitment to truth and a commitment to justice, alongside a commitment to love and trying to avoid some of the mistakes that I made in the past. So one of the things I think that I'm trying to do is challenge my own perspective more. And in a moment, I will kind of go through some of the sort of historical formative factors that have, I think, created the support for Trump that you see on the religious right. Maybe some of you are, have spent a lot of time thinking about that. Maybe some of you have not and want to hear more. But before I do that, I just sort of want to mention that, as I was mentioning to Sari before this, I've been in conversation just over the last several months with a couple authors. I've read their books, I've interviewed them, and it's helped me to further interrogate my own perspective as somebody who started, in a very sort of politically ignorant place, came over the course of many years to a more centrist perspective, and now, because of where politics are, find myself very much on the left in most places. But there are a couple books, I will just mention them. Rui Teixeira's book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? Yasha Monk's book, The Identity Trap. David Leonhardt's book, which some of you, that's probably the most well-known book, which I'm actually forgetting the name of that, but it's about the way the Democrats have not done a good job of serving the working class. And then Michael Ware's book that came out this month, which is called The Spirit of Our Politics. Michael is a former faith advisor to President Obama, and has, in the last year or so, founded a new institution called the Center for Christianity in or of Public Life. I can't remember the preposition. But I interviewed Michael recently and found myself asking him a number of questions about his critique of both conservative evangelicals and also progressive Christians. He specifically kind of writes about Al Mohler, who's the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, who's a leading voice for sort of conservative evangelicals. I would call him sort of faux intellectual. He has an intellectual style that kind of masks a very reactionary fundamentalism. But he also critiques Reverend Barber, who leads the Poor People's Campaign and does, in my opinion, amazing work, advocating for the least of these. But I found myself in a very interesting position talking to Michael, because he was, in his book, making a critique of both of these points of view. And one of the critiques he made is that too often people who bring faith into politics, which he is advocating for, I should be clear. He's not saying we should keep faith out of politics. He's not, he's not advocating for violating the First Amendment. He's just saying that our religious commitments are an important part of who we are, and we bring those principles and we bring those values to our politics, and that's appropriate. People like Eboo Patel, Interfaith America, are making a great, point about the need for our most deeply held values to be a part of the political conversation. But Michael was saying that on both sides, right and left, people often imbue their political judgments and positions with too much moral weight and too much certainty. And, on that point, I could find some agreement, but I felt that it was asymmetrical. I felt that the right was so much more in a place of doing this and, being fundamentalist in the way that they approach politics. And we had this back and forth. And I found it very helpful just in sort of reflecting on it. And and I will put it this way, as I went through the list of factors that I think have created religious evangelical support for Trump, I found myself wondering, could I do the same thing for the progressive or the religious left side of the equation?
Mm-hmm.
Not to, I want to be clear here. I don't view religious progressives or the political left as in any way equal in its problems or errors, or certainly its threat to democracy as I do the religious right. But I just found myself wondering, how much time have I really invested in doing this exercise and really thinking about how to critique not just the side I came from or the tribe that I know best. How much time have I spent critiquing the tribe in which I now sort of over time, very slowly, have come to be a part of? And Michael, in his point, I'll just mention some of the things that he lists as spiritual disciplines, because he's talking about how can, I think, Christ followers not be politically captive, not be so much a part of one side that they lose the ability to be, I think, what some would call prophetic, which is to speak truth, especially to those whom you have common cause with. And if I have, many critiques of the religious right, one of them is that they have thrown all in with one political party. A lot of times that was just, I'll get to that in 1 second, like how that came, but obviously abortion is a big part of that. So some of the spiritual disciplines that Michael talks about are fellowship over aversion, service over othering. And in fact, he talks about doing acts of service alongside people who have different perspectives. Confession over moralization, solitude and silence, anonymous service, study, worship, celebration. He also goes into how we could consume news better, prayer, breaking groupthink, bearing one another's burdens, and then lastly, coming back to what I've been talking about, affirming those you oppose and critiquing those you support. These are all things that Michael talks about as ways for us to, I think, be salt and light in politics and to be prophetic rather than captive. I've kind of just sort of flown over most of my notes without referencing them, but I do want to say go over what I said I would talk about, which is, I have spent a lot of time reading and thinking about how religious right came to where we are now and how evangelicals have come to support Trump. My 10-year-old daughter, who's a bit of a spitfire, asked me the other day, how did Uncle Jerry, why did he support Trump? This is a guy that we knew in Virginia Beach who was part of a very charismatic, sort of quasi-Pentecostal religious practice in the Virginia Beach area. He passed away this past year. And so I thought, how would I explain this to my daughter? And that kind of helped me crystallize some of these thoughts. There's 6 that came to mind. I think it begins, and again, I'm talking about the way that evangelicals have become so locked in for Donald Trump. I think probably the founding, belief here is something a lot of you are familiar with, probably, which is just the idea of America as a chosen nation, as God's chosen, vehicle. This is sort of a fundamental belief of Christian nationalism. The idea that I think a lot of people would sort of equate America to Israel in the Bible. So America is this chosen nation. It is a Christian nation. I think that's the foundation of it. I think another big element is individualism. A lot of evangelical theology is very individualistic. The theology I grew up, the practice I grew up in, was very much focused on a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, personal relationship with God. And I actually think that is quite a strength of evangelicalism as a practice. I think the heart connection that evangelicals have to the divine is sort of the rocket fuel that launched what was known as the Jesus movement in the 1970s. And a lot of my book actually explains how something that was quite promising and wonderful in the 70s became co-opted over time and corrupted and became a failure, which is the subtitle of my book. You know, the practice is very much about my personal experience of God, my emotions. So there's just a lot of individualism. The teaching is never very much about the common good, the community. The theology is not very much about communal sin, communal repair. Insularity would be the third. A tendency to keep to one's own tribe, which gets to what I said at the outset, which is, you know, everyone, no matter of persuasion, can live in a bubble, and so I think, you know, I certainly grew up in a bubble, and there are many elements to why that insularity exists, which I will not go into because that would take us down too much of a rabbit hole, I think. But if anybody wants to ask about dispensationalism, I'm happy to talk about it. Fourth, connected to dispensationalism is a fundamentalist reading of the Bible, a very literalist reading of the Bible, which is a very old story. It goes back to the, you know, founding of the country and the Reformation, I guess. Fifth would be a single issue politics, I think, which, you know, probably a lot of you have seen. Randall Balmer and Anthea Butler, well, actually Anthea Butler would say it's more about race, and Randall Balmer might actually also. But abortion in the 70s, you know, Paul Weyrich was one of the architects of this, wedding the Republican Party to the religious right. And, you know, I think, you know, if there's one reason why Trump's statement of, you know, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it has been true for a lot of religious conservatives, abortion is at the heart of that. And then lastly, sixth, an anti-gospel message, I think, has been preached over decades of a threat of persecution or, you know, elimination. Our faith is under threat. So it creates an environment of fear. So those would be the six sort of things. I'm sure I'm leaving a couple out. Lastly, just two thoughts from—
Was your daughter still listening by the end of all this?
I think it's a sign of my maturity as a parent that I wrote all this down and didn't share really any of it with her. I may have said one or two things, but yeah, I do know my audience in that respect. Two just final thoughts from Michael's recent book, which I recommend. He says politics is important, but not ultimate, which I think is a really good distinction. What is ultimate is faithfulness, in his opinion, and consistency, being the type of person that Christ taught us to be, to love our neighbor, to exhibit the fruit of the Spirit. And then lastly, I think another really important point he makes is that politics is contingent and prudential, not absolute and black and white. Our choices are often not as clear-cut as we are told. It's complicated. Roe versus Wade was overturned, but abortions have gone up. Immigration and refugees are important to us as Christians, but we are seeing the result on border security politically right now even. Not just of xenophobia, which does exist and is always in the mix, but of the failure of Democrats to understand that immigration is an economic issue to a working class that has actually been left behind over the last few decades. So a lot of that is like stuff that I've been thinking about since I wrote my book. The book is more about the background of where I come from and what happened to me coming out of that, and then what happened to the tribe that I come from. And then at the very end of the book, I'm sort of grasping at some of the stuff I'm talking about now. So I'll just leave it there.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jon. Thank you. Yeah. Right. I can't wait to dig into this. I'm going to just ask you a few questions, and then we'll open it up for people. Toward the end of your book, you said, because I was curious about this, who was your intended audience for this book? And then toward the end of the book, you said, I wrote this book out of love. And I was processing that in light of also the people who you mention in your book by name, who probably felt like for them, you were probably betraying them by writing this. So I was curious, what's the reaction been like?
Yeah.
Who were you hoping would read this? Like, what was your vision of an audience as you were writing this, or were you just writing to yourself?
I do think everyone should do an excavation of where they come from as a writing exercise. Or some doesn't have to be writing, but I do think that, writing for yourself in that respect, it's been very cathartic, but also helpful to understand where I come from. You mentioned the title of my Substack is Border Stalkers. That's a term I got from a painter named Mako Fujimura, who's a Christian of Japanese descent. And he got it from Beowulf. But it references somebody who lives between worlds, who goes between different cultures, different groups, and tries to bring understanding between them and build bridges and tear down divides. And so I think that kind of shaped the way I thought about audience as well, because I wanted to write for both religious conservatives and people who didn't understand them, which, I think I was able to do it somewhat effectively, but it definitely makes it more challenging. But I think it also gets to sort of the heart of who I am. And I think part of that is because I was never quite at home in, the church world that I grew up in. I just sort of have been, from the beginning, never fully able to really buy into any dogma, any, sales pitch, I guess. So I wrote for both. I wanted to try to help religious conservatives think about where they come from and sort of try to get outside of their perspective. And I also wanted to explain that world to people who are not from it. And then you asked about my family, I think mostly. My father and I, had the most, he's a character in the book. He's mentioned quite a bit. And writing the book made me appreciate things about him that he did for me, that I hadn't appreciated fully. One of the most ironic things, I think, is that he used to read the Proverbs and the Psalms to us over breakfast many days. And, I'm one of 7 and 3 boys I'm the oldest of 7. And the first 3 of us were all boys, very much into sports. And we were not usually listening very intently. I was reading the Washington Post sports page growing up, Tony Kornheiser. But it made me appreciate what I think he had sown into me. And the irony is that I think that sowing created this friction between us, because the Proverbs talk about seeking understanding and seeking, wisdom. And that, I think that really imprinted on me pretty deeply. And it's been a part of why I'm a journalist. And so that sort of wanting to seek out what's real, what's true, led me to a point of conflict with my father. So we talked about it before it came into publication. that was a hard conversation. I don't know if I can keep talking about it because I haven't talked about this in a while, but we're doing better. And so I'm grateful for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds, John, like you had to stay true to the authentic part of you as you wrote this, even parts that you felt like might not be very popular with those that you wanted to continue to be in relationship with.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned my line about I wrote this out of love. Obviously, it wasn't all love. There was a lot of anger, definitely. I definitely had to go back through the draft, through the manuscript, and do a second, draft that was less angry. Again, I don't think that the anger was going to be effective, So it's not just purely, moral or ethical on my part. I just don't think that, anger has its place. And some of you may be in a place right now where this idea of critiquing, whatever I said at the beginning, there may be things that just sounded off to you. And I'm not laying this out as dogma either. We all come from different places, but this is kind of where I'm at.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more, maybe two more questions on my part, and then I'll invite. So one of the things that you mentioned in your book was you referred to kind of the world that you grew up in as being Gnostic, which I thought was interesting. We don't have to go too deep into that, but you of course explained that Gnosticism is a centuries old, this is your words, a centuries old way of thinking about the world that in its purest form is considered by Christian theologians to be a heresy, which we know that from church history. Essentially, according to this thinking, Gnosticism, the physical world is of little value compared to the spiritual realm. And yet, there's an over focus on sexuality, which, can I just see a show of hands? Who grew up in a kind of an evangelical world who is like here, because this is cathartic for you? Okay. So those of us who've had a lot of experience in that world can connect with that hyper obsession with sexuality. And then the way that kind of bleeds into politics is then like, there's this over focus on the LGBTQIA thing, that is a sin. Abortion connects to that kind of piece of sexuality.
Yep.
And so Gnosticism, in the sense that the physical world is not as important as the spiritual world, but it bleeds so much into the physical world.
Right.
And now you're dipping into politics in a way that's forcing on others your view of sexuality. So I just was wondering if you could just comment a little bit on anything that you found in that question. That
yeah, it is very. I think it's in a previous notebook. I had it in this binder. I spent one day just sort of trying to figure out how does all this make sense. Yeah, I think the Gnosticism comes from the dispensationalism, which is the generally understood to be misreading of the book of Revelation, which takes it as a forecast of what's to come rather than as a metaphor. Ironically, the message of Revelation is to avoid being politically captive to any one person or loyalty, as Bible scholars that I've seen have explained it. But because it was interpreted at a certain point, I am not an expert on the exact timeline here, but because it's been interpreted among fundamentalists as a forecast, it has created what you see in the Left Behind books and movies, which is this idea that Christians are sort of waiting around for Jesus to return, or to actually they're waiting for the rapture, right? Which is they'll be ushered up into heaven while the rest of us, poor souls, go through the tribulation. So I think that is what creates the Gnosticism, which is this idea that the physical present, the material world, is of little meaning and value. And I think that creates the insularity, because if the world that we're living in is really just kindling that is meant to be burned away, then it's not worth much of an investment of our time and energy. It's not very meaningful. That creates the insularity. That creates the lack of a stakeholder mindset, which is somebody who is looking to work for the common good in the here and now. The insularity creates a lack of discernment, because if you are not involved and aware of what's going on, not invested in the common good, then you're mostly, as I was, sticking to, your religious pursuits, your religious bubble, your spiritual experience. That was my experience. I think it's fairly common throughout evangelicalism. And once you are in that position of lacking discernment and mostly being focused on your religious concerns, you are an easy target for manipulation by people who are not acting in good faith, who see your group as a constituency that is easily co-opted and mobilized. So I think that is the trajectory for how there can be both this Gnosticism and also this hyper focus on a few specific political issues.
Thank you, John. We got a microphone right here. Ann, would you pull that out, or Kevin? The reason it's important to speak into the microphone is because otherwise the people who are logging in at home won't hear the question.
Yeah, I'll start.
So actually, Ann, just put it on the side there. I don't want people standing
All right,
right in
good.
front of everyone. So if you have a question,
I'll start.
yeah, and just
I'll start.
pull it up if you want
Okay.
to.
Just to say it shows 19 participants. I know the men's group is a part of this as well. So there's probably double the size people attending right now.
Online.
And I'll stand off to the side. If there's a question, please put it in the chat and I'll try and monitor it. In your book, you mentioned in working with Yahoo, you started this project where you were trying to have conversations with people who were on who were along this lines of what you're just talking about, to try to explain to the rest of us mindsets and try to build dialogue. As a church whose goal is to build community, my real question is, it's one of those, where do we start? And are there equal groups that want to build community with us in what you've found? And sitting here in Montgomery County, how far are they away? And what might you have found in that process to actually say, here's some things you should do to be starting this?
Has anyone here heard of a group called Braver Angels? Is the church involved with that? Is that why you're familiar?
We've done some
Yeah.
activities similar to what they do.
Okay.
Some years ago.
Yeah.
We thought about maybe having a session.
Yeah.
So tell us more.
Yeah, well, I am not personally involved with them. I've just interviewed the founder. If I didn't have the amount of children that we have and the job that I have, I would, I think, try to be more involved with them. But they're a group that's national. They started right before the pandemic, and then the pandemic, I think, really, put a little bit of a big dent in their ability to grow. But they continued to grow. But the lack of ability to do things in person was not helpful. But basically, their idea is to bring people together from different points of view and have conversation, not for the purpose of convincing one another, but rather, I think, just to help each other see, one another's humanity, which is, I think, often lost in our, digital environment. You mentioned the project years ago. That was something that it was 2015, and I was beginning to see the fact even then that we couldn't comprehend each other. Boy, it's incredible to see how much worse that has gotten. So I think what Braver Angels is doing is really important. When you mentioned Montgomery County, one thing that came to mind for a church like this, like, where could you find somebody who's evangelical? I mean, there are, I'm sure, evangelical churches in Montgomery County. I also wonder about Hispanic churches. Like, a lot of the growth for Trump, in the 2020 election was not just white evangelicals. There were plenty of Hispanic evangelicals who were starting to drift that way. So that was one thought I had as well.
So a question from Jay Mallon. When someone describes themselves as evangelical today, does that still say anything about their faith? I hear of evangelicals who don't read the Bible, don't go to church, but do have a particular political view.
Yeah.
So is there still a direct link with religion?
So two thoughts on that. Evangelical has always been a little bit of a tricky term. I think even for people 10, 20 years ago who were the classically evangelical, I think many of them would have identified as something else. You know, born again was a big term years ago. There's lots of AME churches who are evangelical in their, you know, theology, but don't identify as evangelical, in part because of the political element of it. And then secondly, you know, so I think evangelical has become more and more over time a political term. There definitely is an element where it's become more of a tribal marker or even a quasi-ethnic identifier. And there is a segment of the population that has begun to use it. These are people who probably don't go to church very much, but use it more as what I just described. Having said that, Robert P. Jones, who's written several books and runs the PRRI, the Public Research for Religion Institute, something along those lines. He's written several books on this. He's a researcher and academic of sorts. He just was writing about the degree to which church attendance versus non-church attendance is a marker for support of Trump or the Republican Party, and was actually arguing that it's not as much of an indicator. In other words, there are a lot of people still going to church at evangelical churches and fully on board with Trumpism. And if you want to kind of understand that world, I think Tim Alberta's most recent book, you know, does a lot of really good firsthand documentation and reporting, talking to the religious leaders. I mean, the disturbing thing about Tim's book is that it shows that since, you know, 2020, when we had sort of a convergence of a lot of factors, you know, the January 6th and the election denialism and a lot of things around COVID related to sort of parting ways with I'm going to be careful here, but because COVID was such a perfect storm for epistemic chaos, but a lot of problems around, you know, following reality to some degree in COVID. And since then, like, a lot of churches have gone, you know, further down the hole of radicalization, I would say, would be what term Tim's book shows.
Thank you, John. Other questions? Just come on up to this microphone. I know you guys have them.
I know you have them if they don't.
I got plenty.
Yeah.
I was saying earlier, go ahead. Were you going to come up? Come on up. As Jacob comes up, I was going to say, like, some of us in here are recovering evangelicals. Others don't know much about it and are here to kind of learn about it. So there's all kinds of different angles on this. Come on up, Jacob. Jacob's, how old are you, Jacob?
I'm 16.
16.
Do you believe there should be a separation of politics and religion, or like Christianity? That's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of an age-old question, and one that gets a lot of traction. Short answer is, obviously, I believe in the First Amendment, which forbids the establishment of a state religion. But I think, you know, actually Michael Ware's book talks about the fact that, well, he argues that JFK's, you know, speech when he explained that, you know, the Pope would not dictate his politics, was a moment in time in which American politics, sort of at a very popular level, adopted a view that religion and politics were sort of not to be mixed in a way that Michael argues was taken too far. And I think there's some truth to that. You know, it's tricky because you have people now on the right who will say, you know, the separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. We should mix it. And there's elements of that argument that are on a spectrum. Some of that is probably harmless. Some of it is heading towards something called dominionism, which is not quite theocracy, but is close to it. Bottom line, what do I think? As I said earlier, I think absolutely our religious commitments and values and beliefs have a place in politics, but that sort of broad statement has to be explained and unpacked and clarified with carefulness and nuance, because that can mean a lot of different things. But if you want to sort of read somebody who's talked about the place of politics, or I'm sorry, of faith in a pluralist politics, which is a politics in which all points of view and all faiths are equally honored and are not discriminated against. I mentioned his name earlier. Eboo Patel runs Interfaith America. He's a Muslim, and he is doing good work. A lot of it's at the university level, but he's making the case for why, you know, actually our politics and our public life becomes barren if we're not bringing our full selves to it. And as well, like our religious commitments are incredible motivators to acts of service and to serving the common good. So I hope that's helpful, clear.
Go ahead. Just say your name and then.
Hi, I'm Jessica Banthan, relatively new member of the church. I don't know much about evangelicalism, but my understanding is there's this conservative attitude towards women, very conservative. So would you go so far as to say there's some underlying misogyny involved in the church?
Yeah, that's pretty easy to answer. I mean, yeah, I mean, and I think there's plenty of backlash. I think I've seen it. I mean, I even see it in sort of high school. I'm kind of skipping over your question a little bit. Yes, and then just sort of saying I think there's a backlash among, you know, younger men now. We have a 16-year-old son, and sort of some of the influences that I see, you know, coming to him through social media and sort of alternative media, definitely a lot of it through the phone, is certainly, you know, flirting with misogynism. So I think that's just sort of, I think that's an undercurrent of our culture right now, is sort of a backlash among men to, you know, like Jordan Peterson would be, I'm not calling him misogynistic, but he's part of a backlash to men feeling marginalized in certain ways. So that's not.
And how much of that is white men feeling marginalized?
Certainly that's, I mean, I'm just not an expert on this.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, that I think that's part of it, but I think if you also look at the fact that Trump is getting more support from Black men and Hispanic men, I think that's also part of it.
Got it.
Another question from Tom Hebert. Do you think liberal Christianity is its own form of tribalism that has its own insularity qualities?
Great question.
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, I think, you know, all of I didn't say this exactly. All of us live in bubbles, you know. We all live in bubbles to some degree. The question is, how much are we trying to get out of those bubbles? That's really the question. How much are we trying to get out of our bubble, to meet people who don't think like us, to spend actual time in relationship or common purpose with people who think and have differently and have different life experiences and different points of view. So, yeah, I mean, all groups, all faith traditions, all denominations have, it's just human nature. I think it's like evolutionary to seek people who are like-minded, and that's great. But we have to avoid, falling into that easy path.
John, you at one point in your book, you talked about truth. I mean, this is a theme in your book. Just the idea of like, how do you come to the truth, right? And you're exploring the truth just by, deconstructing your own kind of assumptions. And at one point in time, you talk about how liberated you felt when you realized you didn't have the answers to things. And I think that there's a thing about certainty that feels very safe, right? And the evangelical kind of world that I came from, that certainty, that having the pastor has the answers, it's black and white, people gravitate toward that kind of certainty because you have answers. Ambiguity is very scary. And yet you found ambiguity to be safer in some ways. Am I depicting that right, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the question or the statement or the question that I found freeing was, I could be wrong.
Yeah, right. And that's one of the things when you described what truth is, you said truth starts with the questions. I'm going to quote from John's book. You said, truth starts with the questions. It requires an openness to other points of view and experiences, to being wrong, to changing one's mind. A commitment to truth involves a passionate embrace of critical thinking. First and foremost, truth seekers don't search for battles outside themselves to win. Instead, they examine their own point of view, searching for holes, weaknesses, errors. Truth seekers don't pretend to understand other points of view. They inhabit them, walk around in them, try to gain perspective. They hold their conclusions with an open hand. And yet, at the end of the day, a truth seeker doesn't shy away from speaking up.
Yeah, and I mean, the hard part of that is, people say, how do you avoid being a relativist or not standing for anything? And that is the challenge. I mean, there's no easy answer to that. Like, you have to go with what you've got at the end of the day and do the best you can with what you have. That's the only way I can answer that question. But I think your name was Jessica, is that right? You said you don't know much about, evangelicalism. I will just tell you, growing up in that world, that the idea that some of the things I was being taught could be wrong was terrifying to get over. There was just this mindset in which the idea of even asking the question of X, Y, or Z belief or teaching, the idea of even asking the question of, is this true, was anathema. And I think what's been freeing has been the ability to realize, oh, I can ask these questions. The earth will not swallow me whole,
So for Kevin, I'm going to ask one more, just follow up on this. Actually, no, go ahead.
So a follow up from Tom. Was there a non-evangelical person that you have or had a relationship with that helped you realize, quote unquote, I could be wrong? And if yes, what was it that you two shared that helped you to that question?
Well, there was no one person. I think there were a lot of, I mean, I have had I've been fortunate to have been able to be a journalist, because that's given me the ability to seek people out, ask them questions. And even though I came from a place of certainty, my job gave me the excuse to sit there and listen and not argue. So that was a real gift to me, coming from where I came from. And so there were many conversations along the way, many conversations. There was a whole period of time from, the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson for several years onward, where I was like actively seeking out conversations with people of color and trying to ask them, like, what am I missing here? And I was honest with them at times, about like, I don't get this, or, this doesn't make sense to me, or I have this reaction to when you're saying this. And pretty much, across the board, I was always struck by how much generosity that was met with. I think so much of the time, like we're kept from asking these questions for fear of what the response will be. And, that's why it's important to do it in a setting where you're speaking face to face with the person, you're not, in front of a group of people, and there's some level of trust there. That's why relationship is so important. So I don't know if that totally answers the question, but.
Go ahead, Rob, and then Nancy. Why do you guys wait till the very last minute to start asking questions? We got 7 minutes. Come on,
Sorry,
Rob.
Rob
Go ahead.
Hartman. I'm Rob Hartman. So I saw a cartoon the other day that was said conservative Christians have lived in fear for centuries of an antichrist, and when he finally appeared, they voted for him. And while it was a comic, how much truth is there to that? I mean, my cousins who are evangelical Christians in California equate Trump with a chosen one, on a par with Jesus as the second coming. So
Yeah.
how much is that in the entire evangelical community?
My favorite meme that I saw recently was, "I can do all things through a Bible verse taken out of context." If you're asking me to tell you if I think Donald Trump is the Antichrist, I'm going to have to pass on that one. But there's been from the beginning an equation of him with sort of a messianic figure, and to some degree that's unique to sort of his dynamic or his ability to win them over or manipulate them. But there's a pretty long history of looking for a political savior among evangelicals, but that's also a weakness, I think, of our political culture. Like, we look too much to individuals rather than to ourselves and to our communities and to working over time. So if you want to understand that world and that perspective, the best resource I can point you towards is a podcast, eight episode podcast series called Revival Charismatic Fury. And it is a history of the charismatic movement and the way that it became, over the last 20 years, much more aggressive politically. I wrote about some of this in my book. There's a guy named Lou Engle who's part of that New Apostolic Reformation. But the guy who did that is a scholar out of Baltimore. And he's writing a book on this, which is coming out later this year, which is called The Violent Bear It Away, I believe. The Violent Bear It Away. So I recommend that series very much, understanding that point of view.
Nancy.
Yeah, my name is Nancy Adams. What I struggle with is if you talk about evangelicals taking the Bible very literally or reading it very literally,
Yeah.
how can they miss Jesus's teachings and way of life? I mean, that's what I see, the giving, the community, the treating others, well, the neighbors stuff. And I really struggle with that. Where is that missing in evangelicalism?
Yeah. So it's a great question.
It is.
It's a big question. I think, you guys are probably better equipped to answer that one than I am. And I actually would encourage you to ask, your pastors about that, because I think it's a great question. But I think maybe part of the problem is that when you have a world in which anyone can interpret the Bible for themselves, you get lots of, an infinite number of interpretations. And so there's something in that allows sort of political movements to come in and sort of co-opt the Bible. And I think the other half of that equation might be the fact that, yeah, evangelical churches have not done a good job of discipling their members on how to be good public citizens. They've done a good job. They've done a pretty good job of like teaching people how to be a good husband. I mean, for all the hypocrisy that exists, that's true. But like a lot of people I know, like they're good people, like they really do love God, but they just haven't been equipped with how to live out their faith beyond the four walls of the church, by and large.
John, in just the last few minutes, what can we do? So like, there's a lot of, there's a sense of helplessness, I think. Like the only thing that we can do is get out there and vote, and then and hope that that it goes in the right direction.
Yeah.
But these are big forces. I would rather any day get in a conversation with someone about politics who is not using God as the kind of reason for why this or that than someone who's secular, because it's so much harder to kind of crack that nut. And I feel that like when we're sitting here and we're kind of listening to all of this, is it just a kind of like, that's just going to happen, it's going to grow, this movement, Trump is an inevitability? Is there anything that we can do? What's your recommendation as a reporter, what do we do?
Yeah, I mean,
These are big forces.
Yeah, I feel that sense of helplessness, especially because I've been seeing the train coming down the tracks for years, as probably many of you have. I've been frustrated recently that there's a New York Times article recently, people saying, is this really our choice? Like the time to ask that question was over a year ago. We are now, there's just a lack of understanding of how the process works, of how we choose our nominees, that allows us to get to this point. One of the people that I'm interviewing in the next month is a guy who's working on reforming the primaries to get rid of party primaries, to try to get us to a more open primary, like an Alaska model, which I think is a good model, which is where you have an open primary and the last 4 or 5 finalists go to the general election. So there is reform out there. There are reform movements trying to change the system. I would just say that's what I'm looking at. Obviously, in our personal lives, in our church communities, I can tell this community is doing amazing work for your community. And that's probably the most important thing you can do. In your relationships, the most important thing you can do. Love, seek to understand, try to introduce truth when you can with people who disagree, but understand that it's a long, hard battle, and the point is not usually to win, it's usually just to love. And then I think beyond sort of those personal spheres, I'm just looking at who are the people building, who are the people trying to solve problems. We're going to do what we can as a country in the next year, and it will be difficult. And it might not go the way we want, and that will, if Donald Trump gets reelected, that's going to be really hard. It may be that it's not as bad as we fear. I hope that's the case. It may be worse. We just don't know. So the thing that I'm looking at is like, who are the people that are building? Who are the people that are building institutions like Michael Ware, the Center for Christianity and Public Life? Who are the people like Eboo Patel trying to help us bring more of ourselves to our faith? Who are the groups like Braver Angels who are trying to bring us together to understand each other better? And how can I be a part of that? How can I be a part of not just cursing the darkness, but being a part of the solution? That has been part of my focus professionally since the day that Donald Trump won the nomination. So I think we've just got to keep doing that.
Jon Ward, everyone. I'm sure John's happy to stick around for a few minutes if you guys want to come up and say hello and thank him in person.